From his point of view, this was the only answer to the violence and campaign of bombing against his people by the settlers.
La violence appelle la violence, et c'est ainsi que j'ai préparé.
Violence begets violence, and so I organized a workshop to manufacture bombs. Because I hadn't gone to university, I learned from a chemist who taught us how to make a bomb and how it worked. And as soon as we had this ability, that is to say, a weapon like those the settlers had, we used it against civilians.
A decade later, Sadi produced an Oscar-nominated feature film about his exploits in which he starred as himself. The film showed the simplicity and the efficacy of his campaign, nicknamed the Battle of Algiers. Youssef Sadi used young women in his organization who could pass as French settlers to carry bombs hidden in handbags under shopping or beach towels. Once the courier was successfully through the French checkpoints, they left their bomb in cafes and other crowded places. With an eye to the likely reaction on the world stage, the first bombs were timed to go off immediately before a key United Nations debate on Algeria. The bomb that exploded in a French cafe called the Milk Bar was placed by Zora Driff. Today, she is a successful lawyer and politician and has her office immediately opposite the site of her first mission. What ran through her mind that day nearly 50 years ago?
I knew the difficulties we had in making small bombs. You had to get hold of all these ingredients, and that was extremely difficult. You knew the effort it had cost to get this bomb. It had to succeed, and I had only one idea in my head. One had to get through the checkpoint, and it had to be a success. You're not frightened at that point. You're not frightened anymore. You're carrying out an action. You're trying to achieve an objective, and that's what counts. So I didn't any longer feel frightened or anything. That's it. You're possessed by the objective you're trying to achieve.
But what of the certainty of civilian casualties?
You know, we were young women at the time. We knew how cruel the things we were doing were, because we had suffered such things ourselves. What was important was to get a political reaction. Of course, I knew perfectly well that there would be civilian victims among the French. But I didn't feel responsible, because I was aware every day of the tortures, the massacres, the summary executions. Every day we had brothers and sisters, people killed. It was the law of war.
While most of Youssef Sadi's cell of bombers were European-looking Algerian girls like Zora Driff, there were a few French amongst them, women like Annie Steiner and Jacqueline Guérouge.
When I arrived in Algeria, I was shocked by the situation. There was no way I could remain passive in the face of it.
I don't know.
I saw the lives of the settlers and I saw the lives of the Algerians, and it was impossible not to take sides.
Who is a terrorist? In my own small experience of the subject, I saw that when you don't like some organization, a liberation movement or something like that, then they're terrorists. But when they correspond to your own interests, they are fighters. They are heroes.
The French government was in no doubt what it thought, and decided to call on its own secret weapon in the war against the FLN bombers. On the 7th of January 1957, General Jacques Massu marched into Algiers at the head of 6,000 men of the crack 10th Parachute Division. Massu was given carte blanche to smoke out the terrorists. For him, this meant only one thing: information. And if that meant torturing captives or even killing them to gain information, so be it. His right-hand man was Paul Osserès, later himself to become a highly decorated general.
Well,
at the beginning of 1957, General Massu asked me to destroy this organization. And I repeat, to destroy, not to recognize it, or perhaps even to understand it. No, but to destroy it. That is to say, to kill those involved in it, to kill the participants.
It was a time when Algiers became a torture factory. You were sent to the technicians. It was a factory, a torture factory.
Nowhere was that more true than here, the Villa Souzini in Algiers, where the screams of the torture victims in the villa's windowless basement rooms went unheard.
I saw men entirely naked, with electrodes, an electrode on the tongue or on the earlobe, and another on the penis, another on the penis, and then the electricity.
They put you on a table. They wet you a bit with water, and then they connected you to the electricity on the body, everywhere, from top to bottom. They put it on your ears or on your nose, and sometimes they put it in your mouth. And sometimes they would put it there and give you a burst. You jump, of course, with the voltage. Screamed and screamed and screamed. You have to talk. You have to talk. I don't know. I don't know. In certain cases, it was the only solution. In my own work, at least, in my own work. I do not say that it was necessary to generalize its use in Algeria, no. And I would say straight away that, personally, I only ever used torture when it was absolutely necessary.
On the 23rd of February 1957, the French arrested the most senior FLN commander ever captured, Labi Ben Mahidi. Ben Mahidi was one of the FLN's top 5 leaders, and after his arrest, his French captors proudly displayed him for the cameras before handing him over to Paul Osserès for interrogation.
They were thinking, if I do not use the fact that I have in my power a man who is implicated in organization of murders, well, more murders could be committed. So I will use every possible means to prevent more murders to be committed.
Osserès killed Ben Mahidi after 9 days of interrogation. His death was announced as suicide. So why did Osserès participate in this cover-up?
You know, I was too busy, to look at the bigger environment.
You executed him, didn't you?
Yes, yes.
Regrets?
Yes, yes.
Do you regret that?
Yes, yes, yes.
Pourquoi?
Because I was put in I was given a enormous responsibility,
La bataille d'Alger, c'était une grande victoire pour nous parce que
The Battle of Algiers was a great victory for us because it led to torture. It led to torture and it split the French government. The whole world accused France of torturing people, so all eyes were turned on the French. So I think it was a great victory because we won the war.
L'arrestation du grand chef rebelle de la région d'Alger, Youssef Saadi, réputé insaisissable, est un...
In August 1957, after more than a year, nearly 300 bombs and thousands of deaths, the Battle of Algiers was effectively over when Youssef Saadi and Zora Drif were arrested, following information gained under torture from FLN detainees.
Son ami Zora Drif partage sa captivité.
But in spite of winning the battle, the French lost the war in Algeria. Their experience is a lesson to those who say the soldiers should be given a free hand and that terror should be met with terror.
The death row, chiefly among the Muslim community, was reported as...
La première, c'est que la France...
In the first place, France prides itself on being the home of human rights, and by using methods that contravene human rights, we dishonor ourselves completely.
Même si l'adversaire les utilise.
Even if the adversary uses them, that is not a reason to do so.
Eh bien, c'est que l'efficacité de méthodes...
Secondly, the effectiveness of methods of torture, the corvée de bois and others, these aren't the right methods, the right ways to win a war. One only intensifies the hatred of the occupying country, and you end up reinforcing the rebellion.
Et on renforce la rébellion.
In 1962, after nearly a decade of torture and terror, the French government, now under General de Gaulle, decided to give the Algerians the independence they so craved. At just the moment France finally and reluctantly cut loose its renegade North African colony. At the other end of Africa, the story of violence and counter-violence was just beginning. In South Africa, the success of the Algerian Revolution, the replacement of a white colonial government by majority rule, was an inspiration to the most celebrated terrorist of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela. The road that brought Mandela and the black majority to the ballot box in 1994 was travelled with guns and bombs, but only after the failure of peaceful means to effect change.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Nelson Mandela, leader and founder of the sabotage movement Spirit of the Nation and leading member of African National Congress, was accused with the others of plotting sabotage to overthrow the South African government.
Mandela's ANC did indeed begin a campaign of limited violence in the early 1960s, which resulted in him spending the next 27 years in prison.
At the back entrance to the Pretoria court, large crowds gather to watch the accused being driven away to start their life sentences.
With Mandela breaking rocks in a prison quarry, all opposition was always met with brutal repression in South Africa. But by the 1980s, the country was in chaos. While the black townships burnt and South Africa buried its dead, the ANC's bombers hit a variety of strategic targets. One of their most successful commanders had a surprising background in a far-off land.
My great-grandfather was John McBride, who had come to South Africa to fight on the side of the Boers against the British forces here in South Africa. I would say our backgrounds are similar in that my background in my organization is an anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-oppressive background.
15 years after fighting for the Boers, Major John McBride was executed for his part in the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin. Famously, he refused to wear a blindfold as he faced the British firing squad. 70 years later, his great-grandson began his career as a bomber less than half a mile from his childhood home in the slums outside Durban, causing significant propaganda and economic damage to South Africa's apartheid regime.
When we hit the pipelines, the damage on it was the equivalent of 4 million pounds due to the crude oil being burnt, the damage to the canal, and the fact that there was an argument between the two oil refineries as to whose oil line had actually been hit. The fire burned for 3 days, and they had to fly in special fire extinguishing foam from Johannesburg to put out the fire.
South Africa was at war with its own people. To the regime, this was a life-or-death struggle against terrorism. So dissent must be stifled. The dissenters dealt with, and Mandela, the terrorist-in-chief in his prison cell, must be silenced and demonized until he and his organization gave up the use of violence.
The apartheid government was very smart in knowing that they would almost automatically get the support of the West if they condemned preemptively those who were opposing them as terrorists. They were quite firm in South Africa that each time you referred to incursions by the liberation movements, it was a terroristic activity.
As funeral followed funeral, the apartheid regime did everything in its power to portray the ANC's campaign as a race war fought between the forces of civilization and the forces of communist terror. And no one came to exemplify these dark forces more than Robert McBride. McBride had graduated from bombing oil refineries to more life-threatening activities. On the 3rd of May 1986, he killed a policeman as he staged the daring escape of a seriously wounded ANC commando from hospital. He loaded his comrade onto a hospital trolley, and with the drips still intact, the wounded man provided covering fire as they raced through the hospital corridor to the applause of black nurses. Then, on Saturday, June the 14th, 1986, McBride carried out his biggest and most controversial act of terror. Along with 2 members of the ANC, he contrived to place a bomb hidden in a stolen blue Ford Cortina next to a bar on the Durban seafront, which he believed was frequented by off-duty policemen and soldiers.
The operation took place around about 9:30, but we had moved into town already at about 8:30 or so. The car bomb had been prepared during the afternoon. Basically, a car bomb is the same thing as a missile, except your delivery mechanism is different. What we were doing was delivering a missile on wheels. We packed it into the boat. We preferred to use mechanical detonators. We had previously bad experience where electrical detonators were prematurely set off by electrical fields and stuff like that.
What does it feel like driving along the Durban beachfront with a primed car bomb?
It's, well, you're very nervous. You expect the thing to just go off any time. But you have to remain calm because suspicious behavior will draw attention to you, and try your best to look as calm as possible. But inside you, there's torment.
McBride's plan was problematic from the start. Whatever the legitimacy of targeting a bar frequented by off-duty security personnel, the pub in question was not only on a busy road with passing vehicles and pedestrians, but was also right next door to another bar, Magoo's, which was filled with students.
The first thing I remember was deadly silence straight afterwards. Like there was no noise at all, and there was you know that smell of, like an acid smell. That's the thing I remember, was a smell. And then when it kind of like came to, there was a lot of screaming. I don't think anyone knew what had happened. I was there with a girl, a young girl, and we both jumped out the window and we ran away, and probably half a block away, she sat down on the grass. She wouldn't open her eyes. She refused to open them because she just didn't want to see what was going on. And then